Now you're all on the air, just so you know. So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me welcome you all and thank you very much for coming to this event. My name is Mike Schisler, and I'm a faculty member here in the Department of Historical Languages and Civilizations. This, as you probably know, but I will reiterate, is the Center for Middle Eastern Studies Friday Night Lecture Series, which is always held which is a long-standing tradition in our department and in our center, but which is also dedicated to the memory of our dear late colleague, Farouk Mustafa, and I always like to mention that. And it is my exceedingly great pleasure today to be able to introduce both a fabulous scholar and an old friend, Professor Monica Ringer. Professor Ringer comes to us today from Amherst College. We've known each other for enough years that I'm going to pass over in silence how many. She teaches in the Department of History there, and also she's a dual appointment in the Department of History and in the Department of Asian Languages and Civilizations at Amherst College. And she's the author of 3 very diverse but very interesting monographs, as well as a number of articles and edited volumes. I'm going to mention first the monographs. The first one was Education, Religion, and the Discourse of Educational Reform in Qajar, Iran. Subsequently, she wrote what was for me an intellectually important book, Pious Citizens Reforming Zoroastrianism in India and Iran. And most recently, just came out from Edinburgh University Press in 2020, a book called Islamic Modernism, the Re-Enchantment of the Sacred in the Age of History. But in addition to that, and I feel compelled to mention, together with Melanie Levy, she is the translator of Ahmed Mithat Efendi's very famous novel, Khalatun Bey and Rakim Effendi. And she is also the co-editor with Etienne Charrier of Ottoman Culture and the Project of Modernity. And so we obviously have had a lot to talk about over the years and shared a bunch of interests. And it is really a great pleasure to me today to introduce her. The topic of the talk, as you probably know, is God's Intent, Islamic Modernism between Historicism and Re-Enchantment.
Thank you so much, Holly, for your introduction, and thanks, Tom, for setting this up, or actually helping me get here despite air delays and so forth. It's also a pleasure to be here, in part because I've populated the audience with some of my students, or my former students. So it's great to be here. I feel like I'm back in the classroom. Maybe that'll help me relax a little bit. I haven't actually talked for a long time, at least talked publicly, not over Zoom. To be perfectly frank, I've been somewhat recluse since my last book. It was so difficult. I was so tired, and I just have been saying no to everything, no to every book talk. So I told people I'm not well and I'm unable to give a talk. But of course, when I was invited to come here, I made the exception because the University of Chicago is really a special place for me. I've been here a number of times before, and I wouldn't say most recently, but the last time I was here was 2014 when I was a visiting professor of Islamic Studies in Div School, where Nelk generously hosted me. I still have my Chicago ID that I keep as my souvenir from that time. I'm not sure it'll open the doors anymore, but I like to keep it as a memento of that. And in some ways, this visit takes me full circle. Since this book project was launched while I was here as the result of a series of conversations with my esteemed colleague and dear friend Holly Schisler. So humor me as I reminisce about a conversation I had in graduate school with one of our buddies, and I'm not going to say who the buddy was. He asked what I proposed to work on for my dissertation, and I said something like religious intellectuals in Iran in the 19th century. And I'll never forget his response. He said, "There is no such thing as a religious intellectual." And that got me thinking about religion and modernity, but especially about the power of definitions. The relationship between religion and modernity has preoccupied me my entire career. It took me 3 books to really figure out what I want to say about religion and modernity. And in some fundamental way, definitions lie at the heart of it. Now, the challenge of giving a book talk is not to be overly reductionist. I don't want to reduce the complexity of a book to a 30-minute explanation, but I also don't want to reduce the diversity of Islamic modernists to one single voice. So I'm going to remain largely in the abstract and share some of the key ideas that I developed in this book and give you a little bit of a, in a nutshell, conversation, I think, but highlighting in particular some of the theories that I think undergird the book. It is not enough to say that religious modernizers wanted modernity in religion and religion in modernity, although certainly they saw this as their principal objective. I needed to think more about modernity itself. What is modernity? How was religious modernism related to modernity? Why did Islamic modernisms emerge in the 19th century? And how was Islamic modernism related to other 19th century religious modernisms? Now, ever since scholars started talking about modernity, they've been caught up in the task of trying to define what they mean, typically by proposing a set of characteristics which are sine qua non, in other words, essential components of modernity. Yet this endeavor has never been successful. The sentence modern is, or modernity is, has never satisfactorily been completed. Any definition turns out to be empirically unverifiable. Nor is it enough to propose, for example, that Scottish modernity is different than Ottoman modernity. Even within a national or local modernity, there are profound variants. And while I accept the premise of multiple modernities rather than one universal definition, the endless fragmentation of modernities in all of its particular manifestation leaves us no clearer on what we mean by the term. Whatever definition or set of characteristics we come up with turns out to be empirically unconvincing. So I propose that we reframe the question. Let's think differently about modernity. Let's move away from the impossible task of defining it and instead interrogate the definitions themselves. In other words, let's think of modernity not as a perpetually elusive is, but as a claim. Let's focus on what modernity claims to be, claims that present themselves as a set of definitions that function to legitimize certain ideas and practices in certain contexts. Let's interrogate the stories that modernity tells of itself, rather than being seduced into reifying claims as truths. Much the way I would say that we've moved away from Orientalism as an is, an unverifiable and inaccurate, to a set of constructions and claims and definitions. We likewise must turn our objective to the study of modernity's claims, not to investigate whether or not these claims are true. So turning back to the issue of religion and modernity, it becomes self-evident that modernity as a claim is deeply implicated in claims to modern religion. Now, to rephrase this central point, if modernity is a set of claims resting on definitions, then might we also see modern religion as a set of claims to new definitions? This then brings us to the most difficult of the questions, why? The older I get, the more I ask why. Why do religious modernisms emerge when and where they do? And why do they share so many common characteristics? My central contention is this: the emergence and adoption of a new intellectual landscape a landscape that fundamentally reshaped the understanding of humanity in time and space, accounts for the emergence of claims to the modern, and accounts for the emergence of religious modernisms as part of this process. I'm making an unusual causal argument here about modernity, that first the new landscape emerges, and then the necessity of traveling through this landscape generates claims to modernity and the articulation of religious modernisms. Religious modernisms are thus not an is, but emerge from travel through this landscape. We then have to understand Islamic modernism in the context of other 19th century religious modernisms, Catholic, Hindu, Jewish, Zoroastrian, etc. They all emerge in the 19th century. They all resemble each other in fundamental ways. Why is this? I would argue because they're traveling along many common paths through this terrain. Their differences, of course, is that it's not just one path through. There are multiple paths through, but there are some parts of the terrain that you're not going to go over. You know what I mean? You're going to go around a mountain, not up and down over the end of it, but there are multiple ways around it. So I think of the terrain as expressing, in a sense, limits of possibility, that it's not reduced to one single possibility, but neither are there infinite possibilities. This approach, I think, helps us finally debunk some previous ideas of modernity that we know are inaccurate, but that we've had trouble really laying to rest. And the first is that modernity is quintessentially European. I call this the roots argument, ROOTS. That I don't think we can sustain the story anymore of Europe defining modernity and others imperfectly replicating it, that Europe is somehow capable of modernity and others not. Rather, as every society and religious tradition adopts this landscape and makes its way through, it is in many ways similarly transformed. The second idea of modernity that I think we can lay to rest is what I call roots, ROUTES, the idea of modernity as sort of moving through specific lines of transmission with the attendant need to identify a smoking gun. Modernity, I don't think, is a dissemination. You know? It's not an object that travels from one place to another, one intellectual that teaches another, or a seed in new ground. The problem I have with the seed in new ground metaphor is that the seed remains the same. You know, it reinforces the idea that the seed is somehow a European modernity that finds itself in a different context. So I think between roots and roots, however you want to spell it, I think we can move away from that and talk more capaciously about modernity as itself a result of a particular landscape. So what landscape am I talking about? Shorthand, I call it historicism, my new favorite word. But when you look up historicism, I'm glad to see none of you have computers and are prepared to do this on the spot, you find an almost one-word definition, historicity. But this in and of itself is entirely inadequate to explain the complexity of historicism and its profound implications. In my view, and this is the meat of a rather lengthy introduction, historicism is most accurately described at the center of a constellation of ideas, including progress, universalism, empiricism, evolution, and civilization, just to name the most salient. These ideas orbited around the central concept of historicism as context. Contexts are discrete, bounded, and finite, spatially and temporally specific, sui generis. Each society in historical time and space was thus embedded in and thus reflective of its particular context. This tends to be how we see history, so we don't necessarily see how it was before this. Sometimes our assumptions are what makes things invisible. So it took me some time to try to put on certain lenses that would allow me to see the invisible and really work through what exactly historicism is and how it operates. Now, as discrete and contained, contexts were qualitatively different from one another. This foreignness of the past explains the increasingly frequent allusions concerning the rupture between times or ages, which I argue are symptomatic of the adoption of this new historicist landscape. For example, Rousseau in the 18th century wrote that, quote, "The mankind of one age is not the mankind of another age," end quote. Expressing a similar viewpoint in the 19th century, Indian reformer Syed Amir Ali frequently referred to what he called, quote unquote, the circumstances of the age. These statements are manifestations of the permeation of historicism and the embrace of the concept of context. Historicism functioned as both a concept and a method. The presumption of and location in historical context. To historicize is to reveal and position in context, to understand the internal dynamics and thus the limits of possibility of that particular historical moment. So what I'm claiming here is twofold. First, that historicism both necessitated and enabled claims to modernity, and that historicism both necessitated and enabled the emergence of religious modernisms. Historicism imposed new meanings on history, which fundamentally destabilized the dogmas and truths maintained by religious tradition. At the same time, while commitments to the unchanging nature of divine truth gave way to the embrace of historicism, it is nonetheless equally true that freedom from tradition opened up new religious possibilities. The premise of context freed the essence of history and enabled it to be relocated and recontextualized in the present. Historicism dissolved the fetters of tradition. So while in the 18th century, we see Hume declaring that belief in miracles was, quote, observed chiefly to abound amongst ignorant and barbarous nations, by the early 19th century, David Friedrich Strauss, not coincidentally the author of A Life of Jesus, asserted that, quote, "The supernatural birth of Christ, his miracles, resurrection, and ascension remain eternal truths, whatever doubts may be cast on the reality as historical facts." In a sense, it doesn't matter about historical fact. Miracles retain an element of truth. Okay? So deliverance from dogma and freedom to reinterpret religion went hand in hand. It is here in this project of re-enchantment that we need to locate all of these 19th century religious modernisms. Religious modernists, rather than bemoaning the loss of tradition as fixed and permanent truth, sought instead to rationalize religious practice and ethics and to resuscitate what they believed to be the essence of God's intent from the confines of past contexts. This was Strauss's project in his Life of Jesus. This was Renan's project in his Life of Jesus. And this was the Islamic Modernist project in their new Islamic histories. In broad brushstrokes, Islamic modernists had three imperatives. First, to identify religious essence, obviously in this case, Islamic essence, and separate it from its context. In other words, they engaged in an archaeological retrieval of Islamic essence from the sediments of history. Second, to ascertain the historical laws of progress, what I'm calling the historical laws of progress, that determine when religious essence served as a motor of civilization, and conversely, when it was a roadblock to civilization and progress. In other words, if essence itself is constant, when Is essence expressed as an agent of progress, or conversely, a cause of backwardness? In other words, you have to account for the fact that if Islamic essence is constant, why is Islamic history not also constant? And third, to recontextualize this religious essence, this sort of reclaimed truth in the present, and thereby restart the stalled motor of civilizational progress. As a consequence of historicism, by the 19th century, the idea of religion as a universal phenomenon had become firmly entrenched. Religions in the particular were thus expressions of this universal phenomenon mapped onto human civilizational evolution. The explanation of difference moved away from a theologically based true-false binary and was relocated onto a universal taxonomy of mankind's religious evolution. For 19th century religious scholars, religions had identifiable essences that could be located on this taxonomy as points on a line. You know, we could sort of sit here and draw a line and say, where would you locate Islam? Where would you locate Greek religion? Where would you locate paganism, and so forth? And I would do that if we had more time. The one other interesting idea here is that the origins of religions were thought to contain this religious essence, the sort of true inherent nature of religions themselves. Religious essences, in addition to being located in their origins, define the inherent extent and limits of possibility for any given religion, much the way we today might speak of DNA. In other words, the sort of possible height of a particular species of tree. Okay? According to this schematic understanding of religious evolution, primitive religions were expressions of primitive civilizations. Advanced religions were expressions of greater degrees of consciousness of the divine, possible only in more advanced civilizations. Over time, as the human mind evolved, its capacity for consciousness, rationalization, and abstraction grew. Consequently, religions moved from the concrete to the abstract, from fetishism to polytheism, and eventually to monotheism. As they mapped onto civilizational levels, they thus tracked the developmental stages of the human mind as it moved from infancy to adulthood. So in a sense, this is why the study of the primitive, in a sense, involves time travel, not chronological time travel, but evolutionary come civilizational time travel. Adherents of primitive religions, ignorant of natural laws, confounded those laws with divine power in the form of beliefs in miracles, superstitions, and nature worship. Primitive religions, in this view, incline towards the concrete and anthropomorphic, the worship of trees, stones, fetishes, and at a more advanced stage, multiple deities erroneously accredited with divine power. Zeus's lightning bolt and Poseidon's storm were thus fundamentally explanatory, based on misattributions of the origin and nature of divine power. Most critically, primitive religions were overwhelmingly concerned with obedience expressed through the mechanistic performance of external rituals. Religions that emphasized the performance of rituals betrayed a failure to comprehend the intent behind the rituals, confounding the intentionality of practice with the performance itself. According to this view, the performance of ritual was in and of itself devoid of value. In contrast, advanced religions were characterized by greater consciousness of God, expressed in more spiritual, abstract, and ultimately rational beliefs and practices. Laws of nature were no longer conflated with divine action. Advanced religions came closer to knowledge of the truth of the divine, grasped divine intent, and thus were able to dispense with ritual and embrace the ideals meant to animate individuals as well as individuals' interactions in society. The degree to which religions express consciousness of the divine and comprehension of divine nature and intent served to locate them on this continuum of religious as civilizational development in what was an inherently comparative and classificatory enterprise. In this project of locating Islam, Islamic modernists engaged with their Christian religious studies counterparts, particularly over the position of Islam relative to other monotheistic religions. European religious studies scholarship, not surprisingly, located Islam as inferior to Christianity. And equally unsurprisingly, Islamic modernists argued that Islam was in fact, according to these very same criteria, these civilizational and evolutionary criteria, superior to Christianity. They deployed these new historicist intellectual criteria, subtly reshaping older Islamic arguments for superiority based on the Prophet Muhammad's place in the unfolding of Abrahamic revelations, even as they reinforced the ultimate conclusion of Islamic superiority. They did so now on new scientific, historicist, and evolutionary grounds. By locating Islam, Islamic modernists accomplished goal number one, identifying Islamic essence. The next step was to explore historical relationship of this essence of Islam in historical time, not extracting the essence, but looking at how essence played out in history. The new Islamic histories written by Islamic modernists explored ways in which this essence operated in the arc of Islamic history. Why in some periods did Islamic civilization progress and other times not? What were the historical laws of progress that could account both for the Abbasid Golden Age, but also for the current age of backwardness? As Afghani wrote in his famous refutation to Renan, it is permissible to ask oneself why Arab civilization, after having thrown such a live light on the world, suddenly became extinguished, why this torch has not been relit since, and why the Arab world still remains buried in profound darkness. European scholarship accepted the Abbasids as a golden age, but insisted either that this was the apogee of Islamic potential, in other words, a kind of maxing out of Islamic DNA, or following Renan, that the greatness of the Abbasids occurred despite the Arabs in Islam, not because of them. Conversely, the Abbasid Golden Age was touted by Islamic modernists as empirical historical proof that Islamic essence, properly manifest in historical context, was a powerful motor of progress and civilization. In making this argument, modernists claim not only that Islam had produced superior civilizational levels compared to contemporary Europe, but also that properly recontextualized, it could do so again. Interestingly, the prevalent European narrative of the ossification of Islamic institutions and the concomitant rise of dogmatism that prevented intellectual inquiry, creativity, and ultimately further progress was by and large accepted by Islamic modernists. However, they insisted that the ossification of tradition, the shackling of the power and potential of Islamic essence, was not inherent in Islam, but rather historically contingent. Modernists deployed this golden age argument to insist on the decontextualization of Islamic essence and its recontextualization in the present, the rescue of essence from tradition. By comparing Islam in history to Christianity in history, they asserted the Islamic origins of modernity, thus enabling an indigenous future modern, the reclaiming of the torch of civilization. They insisted that modernity emerged in Europe despite Christianity, not because of it, whereas modernity could be generated in Islamic societies as a result of Islam, and Islam freed of the shackles of tradition and cleansed of historical detritus, reharmonized in context. Excuse me. Sayyid Amir Ali expressed this project elegantly when he wrote, "The wonderful adaptability of the Islamic precepts for all ages and nations, their entire concordance with the light of reason, the absence of all mysterious doctrines to cast a shade of sentimental ignorance around the primal truths implanted in the human breast, all prove that Islam represents the latest development of the religious faculties of our being. What this also suggests is that modernity was understood as a civilizational level that in principle was universally available. To cross into this civilizational level, in other words, to evolve, one needed to establish a threshold, a constructed tradition, right? Modernity is never imagined without its binary of tradition, which had to be transgressed by rejection and abandonment. Claiming modernity through the embrace of religious modernism was a necessary way forward. In Islamic modernist vision, therefore, modernity was neither owned by Europe, nor did becoming modern necessitate imitation of Europe. Commonalities, common values, aspirations, etc., were understood as belonging to modern civilization, not European culture, much like Gökalp would come along, right, and argue somewhat later. As part of this process of claiming modernity, modernist Islamic histories also historicized and reimagined the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet was the perfect man, the prescriptive model of a rationalized, internalized, modern pious individual. In stressing Muhammad's spirituality and rationality, Islamic modernists were also careful to note that the rituals Muhammad prescribed were only a means to an end. Rituals were designed to cultivate modern sensibilities and dispositions as avenues of enlightenment and paths to spiritual consciousness. They had no intrinsic value in and of themselves. Piety was oriented towards the effect on the individual, not the act itself as pleasing to God. Faithfulness to God's intent entailed the cultivation of a religious consciousness in the individual, not scripted performance or ritual sacrifice. Again, as expressed by Sayyid Amir Ali, and I quote, "Islam is not merely a system of positive moral rules based on a true conception of human progress, but it is also the establishment of certain principles, the enforcement of certain dispositions, the cultivation of a certain temper of mind, which the conscience is to apply to the ever-varying exigencies of time and place." Muhammad recognized the imperative of manifesting divine intent in laws and prescriptions of piety. Yet, unlike Christianity or Judaism, never made the mistake of conflating these goals with the formalization of ritual or the authorization of clerical intermediaries. And I just want to digress by noting that one of the criticisms often levied against Islam and Judaism by Christians was on the question of the sort of prevalence of the law in Islam and Judaism. And they argued that law was sort of representative of why these religions couldn't evolve. Whereas interestingly, not all Islamic modernists, but some Islamic modernists said, you talking about law as though it's something that we wouldn't want, but actually what's the point of religion without law? I mean, isn't the point of religion is to get everyone to behave according to it? And so law in and of itself is not the problem. Law sort of moribund and stuck in earlier contexts is the problem. So they had very much a kind of right back at you argument saying, you're right, Islam does have law, and that's the problem with Christianity is it never did. Yeah. Now, Muhammad recognized, the Prophet Muhammad also embodied a fundamental duality. He was a product of his own particular historical context, and yet via divine guidance capable of transcending it. He was embedded in historical context, but freed of its tethers by God. The prophet was the incomparable man, human, yet enjoying divine knowledge, born of 7th century Arabia, but transformed by God into the translator of God's intent on earth. To give one example of such a translation or negotiation, if you like, Islamic modernists argued that slavery was not essential to Islam, yet it was not prohibited by the Prophet. Why? Not because the Prophet condoned it, but rather because it could not be eliminated all at once. The limits of possibility of the Prophet's society could not sustain such a rapid departure from existing socioeconomic structures. The Prophet thus perfectly understood God's intent as the eventual elimination of slavery and displayed genius in enabling progress towards this ultimate goal to the extent that his particular level of civilization allowed. It would fall to later, more civilizationally evolved societies, in other words, us now, Islamic modernists, to eliminate slavery. And the same argument was made concerning religious tolerance, women's rights, and other modern values equated with Islamic essence. Evolution, in other words, takes time. This historicization of the Prophet also undergirded, although not always explicitly, an entirely new Islamic methodology that I call from prophetic sunnah to God's intent. God's intent, correctly perceived by Muhammad, was refracted by the necessity of implementation and the limits of possibility that this imposed. God's intent is perceptible through the historicization of the Prophet. To understand the Prophet's historical context and its attendant limits is to discern the intentionality in his actions and directives, and by extension, God's intent as embedded in his own. The identification of God's intent, therefore, requires a dual translation. First, of the Prophet's context, and secondarily, via his context of the Quran. In other words, embedded in the prophetic hadith is the Prophet's intent, and embedded in the Prophet's intent is ultimately God's. Another way of saying this is that the hadith and the sunnah must be gauged for the Prophet's intentionality as it refracted and reflected God's intent. This innovative hermeneutics of the Quran and Hadith formed the basis for a new methodology for discovering and implementing God's intent in the modern age. Islamic modernists insisted that contemporary religious reform must embrace this essential truth of the existence not only of the essence, the eternal, immutable ideals of Islam, but also the recognition of the inevitability of historical change, of the movement from one context to another, the particular, historical, and finite, the permanence of impermanence. Failure to recognize historical context was to insist upon the replication of more primitive manifestations of essence appropriate for more primitive contexts. In other words, the maintenance of tradition. In their new Islamic histories, Islamic modernists transformed the definition of tradition. The relationship between God and humankind shifted from one characterized by external recognition of the immanence and supernatural power of God to one characterized by the internalization of ethics and the centrality of individual consciousness of the divine. Modern religion folded humanism into an enduring eschatological framework whereby God's intent was consistent with the civilizational progress of humankind. History retained its movement towards infinite perfection, the fulfillment of God's intent. I reject the notion that religious modernism was reactionary or anti-modern, or that secularism and the end of divine immanence entailed the marginalization of religion. Religion was redefined and relocated, not eliminated or marginalized. Religious modernism's fundamental project was the unification of religion and modernity. Religion must, modernists believed, continue to animate modern society. The desacralization of tradition via historicism permitted the resacralization of God's intent as manifest in human religious evolution. what I call the re-enchantment of Islam in the age of history. Yet at a fundamental level, Islamic modernists failed to reconcile their commitment to historicism with their commitment to re-enchantment. It was not simply the magic of superstition that criticism necessarily destroyed. Criticism destroyed all certainty, all claims to truth. However profoundly religious modernist historians sought to reestablish a secure link with the sacred past, they ultimately had to contend with the methodological impossibility of certitude implicit in the positing of historical context. Historicism was a useful tool in demolishing claims to definitive truth and claims to tradition as unerring precedent, but unwieldy in identifying and retrieving an acontextual and ahistorical essence. The conceit of religious modernists was the denial of their own context. Modern values, rather than being recognized as the products of their own context, were claimed as eternal, as consistent with God's intent for mankind. Modernists thus deployed their own values as yardsticks to identify and retrieve essence, but conflated them with essence itself. One could argue that religious modernists embraced the lack of certitude historicism demanded and merely constructed a possible historical narrative, a Prophet Muhammad who might have existed. Yet this humility is belied by their hubris in claiming to rediscover truth, the essence of Islam, and to claim the capacity to accurately interpret God's intent. Thank you all.
I think the floor is open. Thank you, Monica.
It's a pleasure. It's been a while since I stood up in front of more than a classroom and talked about hadith and so on. Yes.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. When you were here, I was on sabbatical somewhere else, so unfortunately. On the Jewish and Islamic law, and we had exactly these strange kind of interactions where every class, teacher was teaching the Jewish law section, I was teaching the Islamic law section, and sometimes he started, sometimes I started, and what we found is that that all the students, I mean, there were Muslim students, there were Jewish students, and then there were just other students who were interested in the topic. And it turned out that first of all, the Jewish and Muslims were very keen on finding these things, what's the meaning behind this law, etc. But what is really interesting is that when they asked for readings about this, I could provide them with a whole literature, while the professor on the Jewish law side said, well, really that's just some sort of, maybe your rabbi told you that, but I don't really have any classical texts to give to you on this. So I'm just wondering to what extent, when you say modernism, that there's different, that there is, I mean, I give you just totally different example. There's a whole genre of Islam and Nuzul. What is the context in which the specific verse was revealed? And that is a large literature, and for the Quran, that's not a literature that exists for the Hebrew Bible, for example. So in terms of kind of historicism, really, I mean, it latches onto that and it uses that, but there are traditions that are actually more suitable in a sense for that historicism, because they have the sciences already, or the literature that are already ready to cater to this. So that is, sorry, it wasn't really a question, it was more of a.
No, but thank you. That's a really interesting comment. And, again, clearly I can't talk about everything in just a few minutes that I have, but I think one of the dangers about writing about modernity is to see all of it in conversation with with Europe, right? So one of the reasons I picked the 4 people that I picked was partly because they were all interlocutors with Renaud. And I really wanted to bring in the fact that this is, in a sense, a global, or at least an international conversation that religious modernizers are having with themselves. And these Islamic modernist intellectuals were not only reading what people are saying about Islam, but they're also reading what religious studies scholars are saying about historicizing Christianity. But I think what's so interesting about your point, and well taken, is that one of the things we have to remember, and I sort of made a gesture to this, but I'm not, really the one to do it, is in what way were Islamic modernists mostly in conversation with their own tradition, not so much other people's traditions, but in a sense, building on the idea of the historicity of the Quran is one way in which, then that conversation would be very different in some religious traditions than others. I hope you're not recording. I have terrible dust allergies. But thank you so much.
Can I get you to, if I follow on that a little bit, I'm going to give you what? I think in some ways you came, but one of the things that really brought you to this was your work on Zoroastrianism, as a place that started you to think about this in another way. And I wonder if you could sort of compare what you found in your work on Zoroastrianism with what you found in your work on Islamic modernism.
Well, when I started the book on Zoroastrianism, actually I started it because I left Zoroastrians out of the first book. And the first time I went to Iran, our friends were Zoroastrian, and they said, well, how come you left Zoroastrian religious reform out? And I said, good point. I mean, it's interesting why, because I didn't bump into it, but clearly I have to do something about that. But then I quickly got interested in the sort of debate that Zoroastrians in India were having with these Scottish missionaries. And what was so interesting about that was that you could see the responses. And again, it was one of these dialogues. And for various reasons, Zoroastrianism changed radically and sort of noticeably in this period. But I thought, well, this is a good trial run to try to figure out what these criteria are. I mean, it seems obvious to us that, monotheism is superior to non-monotheisms, but why? So if you say, why? Why did they think that was the case? Why, in a sense, were these Protestant missionaries attacking Zoroastrianism as dualistic? What's wrong with being dualistic, and trying to uncover, in a sense, the taxonomy of these criteria. So in that sense, being able to understand what, in a sense, was emerging in terms of this landscape was really useful. But I always wanted to come back to the question of what's going on with Islam. And I think what's happened is that I've moved from thinking about these things as a dialogue to thinking much more about different paths through the landscape. And I guess it all seems simple now, and I guess I would describe modernity much more in terms, say, of technology, the way we say technological innovation or the way that moves around the world is not really about adopting American technology or adopting, you know, but it's sort of like when it's necessary and when these things become relevant, they emerge in a particular context. But the larger question of comparatively, one of the questions that, or one of the ways that people often frame this process is a process of Protestantization. And so some people were saying, oh, well, you know, Jewish modernism is really just a Protestantization. Zoroastrians were called the Protestants. And the question is, should we view this as not so much something that's happening universally as passed through the landscape, but should we see it as something that's being refracted and in a sense, not exactly imitated, but in this sort of model of adaptation? And I guess I would say no, but Protestantism obviously comes up as well, this sort of interiorized consciousness, a sort of rationalization, the interiorization of ethics and all this stuff sounds very Protestant. And so I guess I would just say, perhaps we could think about it in terms of certain kinds of ways of dealing with these questions so much as later sort of biblical studies as moving through the landscape first. It doesn't mean other people moving through the landscape are following them. They're just also confronted with similar questions and similar explanatory needs and adopting the landscape in similar ways. So comparatively, I think is extremely useful. All right, hi.
Hi, it's so nice to see you in person.
Nice to see you too.
So, I had two questions. I also found this absolutely fascinating. So the first question is about sort of local discourses actually with Christians. So for example, in Egypt, late 19th century, early 20th century, Renan's Life of Jesus is prominent, and there's a Syrian Christian translator called Farah Hantoun who produces this in Arabic, Hayat al-Masih. And then he popularizes this in a novel where there's a character called Ilya that like quotes Renan verbatim, because that's what you do. You write historical novels, and you know, Holly can tell you about like how history is being told there. But then there's also, you know, Georgi Zaidan was producing these volumes of history. Margalia translates them. So when these Islamic modernists are writing, at least in the Egyptian context, it seems to me that they're also responding to, you know, what local Christians are writing in Arabic, to what Jews are writing. So if we sort of think about the category of Islamic modernists across several languages and things like that, how do we also account for not the tradition, not the dialogues that they have with Renan or the Europeans, but actually with Christians and Jews that are living next to them, that are engaging in these traditions. And I imagine similar things are happening in Armenian and in other languages. So
Sure.
That's one point. And another point is that I wonder what is being lost in the shift to historicism. So my current project right now is like how it is about Jews sort of celebrating certain historical events. And for these guys, especially in the early modern period, it's like, you know, Suleiman the Magnificent beats a rebellion in Egypt. That's God's intervention in history. And this is a victory for the Jewish people. Murad IV liberates Baghdad. That's God's intervention in history. Thank God we have all. So, and there's something very reassuring about this. History has patterns. God intervenes. You can identify this pattern. So even things that don't appear as miraculous can be interpreted as that. So I wonder also, like, what do we lose with historicism? Because there's something also very reassuring in circular histories, in chronicles that are not necessarily sort of linear, but also repetitive. So,
yeah. Thank you. Those are two excellent questions. I mean, I think the focus of this book was thinking about the conversations that are happening, not just within Islamic modernists or between Islamic modernists. Istanbul seems to be one of these big centers where conversations emerging due to the, printing press, but also, obviously, if you're thinking about any specific conversation, you have to think about it in its local terms as well. I mean, it's not just, as you say, people reading Renan, but people reading Renan from different religious traditions in dialogue with each other in particular places. And so each of the Islamic modernists that I looked at, and I only looked at 4, I'm trying to sort of tease out what are their common assumptions, but also really looking at some of the differences and varieties between them. And of course, I don't want to underestimate how different they are. I mean, Said Emir Ali, for example, is very much along the idea of, increased religious consciousness is basically the explanation of human civilizational evolution. Whereas Al-Afghani is much more about, you can even have progress in backward religions. I mean, let's look at Persia. Wasn't Persia a really great empire? So they have different explanations. And I do take your point that it's important to look at the local conversations as well and not just focus on as if there's only one conversation happening. I brought Renan in partly because I wanted to get into the idea of dialogue, but I wanted to bring him in as a secondary figure and not have it be him with people responding to him, but instead people thinking about their positionality in their own religious tradition, which of course is diverse, but also reading people's work like Renan's and his Life of Jesus. What I like so much about Said Emir Ali in many ways is that he cites Europeans, he cites Europeans saying, the high point of the Abbasid period was, better than what's happening in Europe. But he also cites Renan and says, well, as Renan says, we really can't recover Jesus. Too bad for Christianity. We can recover the prophet. So he's in a sense deploying it by saying Christianity in essence is really great. But Jesus died before he could implement laws. We can't really recover Jesus, which Renan himself says. Renan himself says it's a bit like asking people, actually what Renan says is it's a bit like interviewing people that had run into Napoleon years later and saying, what did you think? And that is a bit like what we've got with the Gospels, that we're not trying to actually reconcile facts, but just get a sense of the person. Interesting things like that. And what I like so much about your second question is, in a sense, what is lost with historicism? I think what's lost, as you say, is tradition. And tradition, I mean, I remember, Holly, you once came to Amherst and said tradition is like an anchor. It's very comforting.
Yeah.
I mean, it creates problems, but there's also something very nice about it. And I think in the Islamic modernists that when they really boiled everything down to good thoughts, good words, good deeds, what was left, that was quintessentially Zoroastrian? What was left that could really keep the community together? And so even though intellectually they, were embarking on this project, as a community, it didn't mean that they necessarily abandoned tradition. But that if you really see tradition as constructed, it's very hard to feel the same way about it. And I think that's something we all, in a sense, understand. And people have worked on, when we think about disenchantment, I mean, it's not happy necessarily, it's not comforting to be disenchanted. I just wonder if, and in a sense why I call this a re-enchantment is they're trying to re-anchor it. And they're trying to say all is not context. There is something that is essence. And I guess we have to decide if we agree or not, which I sort of say I don't agree. But if we're going to insist that there's something that is not contextual, then you can cling on to the essence, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there are things that are lost.
I just want to say, Orit, that there's a wonderful little thing I use sometimes with my serving class by the
patriarch of Jerusalem, that says, and then the Ottomans came and they saved us from those Latin Christians. God gave us the Ottomans.
Thank you for this lecture. It's really hits home for me, and it brought up a whole new idea of a way of a new field for study. I'm an ethnomusicologist, and my study is in Cuba, where I work with an African-derived religion called Santeria. The Orishas of the gods of Santeria are really closely related to the gods of Greece and Rome and the saints of Catholicism. And the Santeros in Cuba are negotiating this very ancient African religion and trying to reproduce it or save it, right? Protect it, while they're negotiating through modern Cuba. And it occurred to me that no one has done any research in terms of the references that you made to what effect it's having on it, and how can we actually analyze it and put it in context. So my question to you is, how could I go about taking your criteria and applying it to something where there's really no, there's no references, there's no place else to look to figure out how I could apply that to use it in my work?
That's a hard question for me to answer.
It's a hard question for
Applying
you
my
to formulate.
methodology to ethnomusicology, but
Well,
I guess it's all
still
about,
anthropology.
what continues through. I mean, what's considered essential? We're always thinking about, things change, but in a sense, we're trying to maintain the essence. We're trying to say, it's fine to have changes, but what's really the intent? And maybe, we can keep that, but change things. So I would just say maybe there are ways of investigating music for, things that are constant, even though adapted.
Well, it's
I
the
don't
culture of the religion that's changing,
know.
right? So I mean, I'm coming in through the back door, right? So I'm coming in through music, but who makes the music? What kind of people are they? And how have they changed? Because so many people think of Santeria as an African religion, and it's not. It's an African-derived religion, but it has roots that has some of the same roots as the Greeks and Romans. So I thought maybe there might be resources I could look at that would help me put this in some kind of context.
Santeria is not a scriptural religion, am I right about that?
Yeah, they don't read or write.
Yeah,
They read or write in Spanish.
so, I mean, but there's no sacred text exactly, or.
There's a large body of myths, the Patakis. There's a large body of mythology that they transmit orally
I mean,
and
it would,
recreate.
I guess it would be interesting if there's any record. I don't know that there are records, but if you have records that show you how those myths were, somebody 50 years ago transmitting one of those myths and talking about it, interpreting it, right? And sort of comparing that to how a contemporary person who's engaged in kind of the revivification of the tradition deals with the same piece or a similar piece. You might be able to begin to tease out
What's retained in a sense of the myth, or what was the intent of the myth,
or how it's being reinterpreted to
It's perfect.
to address modernity.
How they ride the wave, right? Because
Yeah.
they have religious or medicinal teachings that were altered by AIDS.
Mhm.
When AIDS hit the island. And now I'm about to go back down there, so I'll find out. But we're hearing about how they're dealing with COVID. So how does the religion
that's
deal
that,
with
yeah.
COVID? Things like that. That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that would be the way that, to have those points and see how they're pulling on the threads.
Creative thought.
thank you all so much for coming. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Space for some question. I mean, are we still in the period of modernism, or are we now? I mean, is this?
Or are we really postmodern?
Like essences?
Or maybe we're
Do
postmodern.
we have postmodernisms where we're just about the tradition, but we actually don't really care whether there's an essence anymore?
I have no idea. I don't move beyond the 19th century. But I will say that, one of the first books that I read when I became interested in Islam as an undergraduate was, I think, called Islam and Modernity by Fazlur Rahman, right? Who is from the University of Chicago. And rereading that years later, the methodology that I described really undergirds that, even though he's not saying as much. And so I think this has a relatively long shelf life. Now, I wouldn't be surprised at all if a lot of other things are happening as well, but I think it helps us understand what's been happening since the 19th century and how we tend to think about religion without realizing it. But I'm not at all in a position to say what's happened since. I'd be interested for your thoughts on that.
I mean, on the side note of that, I mean, Leo Strauss is also, of course, an important voice at the University of Chicago, and him and his students were always against historicism, because historicism of the great thinkers, you're not allowed to historicize the great thinkers, because then you're relativizing them. You're meant to read them
As monuments.
historicized way.
But I mean, he does argue, for example, that you have to read the Quran for intentionality.
I'm sorry, I'm talking about Leo Strauss, not about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think my vote is that we're in postmodern.
Thank you all for your questions, and maybe we can chat individually at the reception, right? Which is where?
Downstairs, I believe. Am I right?
Downstairs in this building.
Wonderful.